This video will teach you how to understand Mars in the first house, and we'll begin by reviewing what the first house is. The first house is the area of sky around the eastern horizon. The eastern horizon is where the sun rises. The sunrise symbolizes the beginning of things, and things beginning means things becoming visible. So the first house symbolizes birth, the beginning of things, the beginning of you if it's your chart. And what is born? The body. So the first house signifies your body. And what's the body? It's the physical, visible, manifest, born aspect of self, you. The first house symbolizes manifestation, whether or not things become manifest, real, tangible, practical, solid, visible. And it represents the manifest, visible, tangible traits of things, especially traits of the body and the self, your character, your strengths and weaknesses, your health, and so on. So our quest to understand Mars in the first house is halfway ready to begin, because we understand the first house. Now let's take a look at Mars. The root of everything Mars symbolizes is masculinity. And masculinity has two key aspects to it. It's independent and it's inceptive. So Mars signifies individuality, independence, freedom, and Mars signifies self-reliance, and Mars signifies strength. What do you need to be independent? You need self-reliance. What do you need to be self-reliant? You need strength. And therefore Mars is very involved with everything that increases and amplifies and accentuates and extends our strength. So it has to do with weapons. It has to do with tools and technologies. Furthermore, Mars represents conflict, because that's what happens when individuality and independence is the focus. If the group is the focus, then cooperation is indicated. But if the individual is the focus, then conflict or separation. So Mars represents conflicts, contests, competitions, struggles, wars, so on. Masculinity is inceptive. It gets things started. It initiates the pregnancy. And so Mars is the planet of initiative, making the first move, having the inspiration, the plan to do something. Thus it represents passion, hunger, lust, wants, the things which motivate the initiative. And hence it represents bravery, the willingness to take the risk, to take the first step, to go into a new area. And when you make the first step and you take the initiative to follow your passions, what are you actually doing? You're actually taking command. Mars represents making decisions, becoming dominant, being the direction giver, being the trendsetter, being the path setter. So now we know about Mars and we know about the first house. It's pretty easy for us to figure out what Mars signifies in the first house. All we have to do is put these two palettes next to each other and see what resonates between them. For example, Mars has to do with inception, initiating things, and the first house has to do with beginnings. So this is going to make all of those things in Mars's inception tree. The initiative, the passion, bravery, the command, all those are going to light up and come out to the forefront when Mars is in the first house. Another thing that resonates between Mars and the first house is that Mars is all about individuality, and the first house is about the self. And there's also a third thing about Mars in the first house. Mars has to do with strength, and the first house has to do with the body. So all we have to do now is take these three resonances between Mars and the first house and sort of color them in or flesh them out and see what they mean. So let's look at this first thing. Mars represents inception and the first house represents beginning. So Mars in the first house signifies a go-getter, an ambitious person, a passionate person, a person who's lusty and hungry, and therefore who is brave and willing to take risks and have adventures and go out in search of their desires and ambitions. Now let's explore the second thing. Mars represents individuality and the first house represents the self. So Mars in the first house represents a self-determining person, norm-defying. They do their own thing. Freedom-loving, self-reliant, independent. They don't like to be coddled. They don't like to be led and pampered. They like the risk of doing their own thing their own way. And finally, Mars represents strength, and the first house has to do with the body. So Mars in the first house signifies physical vitality, physical strength, musculature, so resistance to obesity. Now, who are some people? Donald Trump, Anais Nin, Ernest Hemingway, and Agatha Christie. All these people are really great examples of Mars in the first house because they're all go-getters, they're all ambitious or passionate, they're all very individualistic, norm-defying, self-determining. Trump is a very good example of Mars in the first house because A, it's very close to the ascendant, and B, it's in Leo. So Leo is also very masculine and self-oriented and fiery and ambitious. And it works out well to him and he becomes a lucky person because his Mars happens to be his ninth lord. Anais Nin, on the other hand, shows the lusty side of Mars in the first house. And sure enough, her Mars is in Libra, Venus's sign, the air sign. And with Rahu very close to Rahu, and her Mars is her seventh lord, which has to do with sexuality and intercourse. Then we have Ernest Hemingway, who's a very adventurous, macho, freedom-loving type of person, but is also a famous and great writer. So his Mars in the first house is in Virgo. And it is the third lord for writing skills, and it's square to the fifth lord for artistic skills. And then finally we have Agatha Christie. Less of an adventurous, wild type than the other three, but also very much a trendsetter, a norm defier, and an individualist, and also a writer like Ernest Hemingway. So her Mars also is very close to the ascendant, but it's in Sagittarius, not Leo like Trump. Sagittarius is more like Virgo in the sense of it being intellectual, so it's more like Hemingway. And it's her fifth lord, just like with Hemingway, it's his third lord squared the fifth, so it has to do with communication and writing. Furthermore, her nature is less outgoing and risk-taking than the others because her Mars is with Ketu, and her Mars is also her 12th lord, etc., etc. Actually, there's many, many, many details about each of these charts. That's very fascinating and very important to understand any interpretation, whether it be Mars in the first house or any planet in any sign or any house. You have to put that interpretation in the context of the entire chart. But in this video, I really just want to focus on what Mars in the first house means. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Understanding Mars in the second house is really a rather simple matter of knowing what Mars symbolizes and knowing what the second house symbolizes, and then just observing how those two things overlap. So let's start by reviewing what the second house symbolizes. It's the part of the sky That's below the eastern horizon. So this is the part of the sky that holds up the eastern horizon, and thus it represents things that hold up what the east symbolizes. The east is the sunrise. So the second house symbolizes things that support the beginnings of things and support things becoming real and visible. So this is why it represents our foundations, the things that hold us up, the things that give us stability. And that in turn is why it represents our family, the things that hold us up, the people that hold us up, the people that give us birth, people that support us, our true friends. The second house is also the house of wealth. It doesn't refer to frivolous or entertainment wealth. It refers to the wealth upon which we build our life. We build our home, we build our body through food and so forth. So this sort of wealth also has to do with nutrition, food, diet, and so on. And now, since the second house is pro-visibility, this explains why it's a house of knowledge, education, what we know, because it means what we can see, what we can bring into clarity. And finally, the second house is a house of realism, real things, things which can be made visible, things which can be made demonstrated. So now we understand the second house and what it symbolizes, so we're halfway to understanding what Mars in the second house symbolizes. We just need to review what Mars symbolizes. The base or root symbol of everything about Mars is masculinity. And masculinity has two key components. One is independence, and the other is inception. So Mars is extremely independent. It signifies individuality and freedom. In turn, it therefore symbolizes self-reliance. If you want to be independent, then you have to be self-reliant. In turn, it therefore symbolizes strength. So Mars represents all sorts of things that augment, improve, and amplify our strength. So not just muscle, but also tools, weapons, machines, and technologies. Now, what happens when you have strong, independent, individualistic persons? You have conflicts of interest. So Mars symbolizes conflict, competitions, which can also escalate into wars and violence. The masculinity also is inceptive, and that's why Mars is a quickening planet that symbolizes our initiative, our ambition. In turn, this is why it's a planet of passion, lusts, and ambitions, and hungers for things. In turn, that's why it's the planet that signifies bravery. Bravery is the willingness to take a risk to fulfill our desires, our passions, etc. So Mars is all about confidence, courage, and riskiness. And finally, this is why Mars is very commanding. If you are the one to initiate something, give inception, then you're the one to give direction. So Mars likes to give direction, likes to take command, likes to be dominant, but also functions well in any kind of chain of command, as long as the chain of command is clear. Now we're ready to get directly to our main topic, Mars in the second house. All we need to do, as I mentioned, is take the symbolism of Mars and compare it to the symbolism of the second house and see where there's overlap. So for example, Mars symbolizes conflict, but the second house symbolizes family. So there's an overlap in the sense of Mars clashing with the second house, because Mars is all about people that you fight against and you have rivalry with, but the second house is all about people that you cooperate with and who support each other. Another example of how Mars and the second house overlap: Mars is the planet of strength, and the second house is very strong because it's the Earth underneath the eastern horizon, and therefore it has to do with stability, strength. So this is one way that Mars and the second house overlap in a good way. And the third overlap between Mars and the second house is that Mars has to do with decision making. Giving commands basically means being the one who makes the decisions. The second house overlaps with that in a good way because it's the house of knowledge. But whether or not this is a harmonious overlap or a disharmonious overlap is rather complicated. So let's just say that this is a mixed overlap. There's good things about it and there's not so good things about it. And now that we've identified these three ways in which Mars and the second house overlap, this is our food for thought in trying to visualize and intuit and understand Mars in the second house. Let me show you how you can expand and unpack these basic capsules of meaning. So let's start with competitors versus supporters. What this says about Mars in the second house is that it symbolizes rivalry. A person that has a lot of rivals, or a person who doesn't cooperate well. They prefer to challenge rather than cooperate. They don't go along with the flow. They go against the grain. And it would be especially noticeable in a family unit. They will go against the customs of the family, or the extended family, or the very extended family, which is the society. And it also impacts the very nuclear family, which is the marriage. One thing we can also say about this particular overlap is that Mars in the second house represents an ambition to be better than, or to get more than, or to somehow or other surpass one's family. And again, the family has all those three scopes: immediately in terms of the spouse, more extendedly in terms of the bigger family, and very extendedly in terms of your whole culture or society or neighborhood. So that's an example of how you can intuit and flesh out that basic capsule of meaning of the conflict between Mars being competitors and the second house being supporters. Let's do the same thing for the second one. This is a harmonious overlap of Mars being strength and the second house being stability. So Mars in the second house signifies a great deal of strength. But put it in the context of the first thing that we just interpreted, which is kind of rivalry. So rivalrous strength or defiance. The ability to not conform, non-conformity, and the ability to win in difficult situations, to win against odds. Then finally, let's look at this complex overlap of Mars being decision-making and the second house being knowledge. There's a way in which this is good because you make your decisions based on knowledge, right? But in a way, no. In a way, actually, decisions are not really conducive to knowledge, because decisions end the knowledge process. So the way knowledge feels about decision is that decision rushes. The way decision feels about knowledge is that knowledge procrastinates. So this issue of Mars being in the second house, it does give a intelligent or decisive thinker with a quick intellect, but it also gives a proclivity towards rashness or away from very pensive thought or really thorough education or reflection or investigation. So now we have a fairly clear idea of how to interpret Mars in the second house. And it's based on a very flexible way of looking at Mars in the sixth house, where we can intuit more detail or different facets of them if we want. Which is important because in any particular chart, you'll have to put Mars in the second house against a whole context that's different from another chart that you look at Mars in the second house in. But one other thing that's very useful to do when you're studying the basic meaning of a planet in a house is to look at well-known figures who have that. So for example, Mohandas Gandhi. First thing we identified with Mars in the second house was a clash between competitors and supporters. And we said that this indicates a person who's not cooperative. Well, that is literally Gandhi's trademark: non-cooperation, civil disobedience. With Gandhi, we can also see a clear illustration of the ambition to surpass one's family. And Gandhi helps us see the facet of it expressed as the ambition to change your family, to change your society. And also Gandhi illustrates that contention or rivalry with the very small family in terms of how it affects marriage and sexuality, because he had a very contentious sexual life. Second thing we looked at was the strength, defiance, and nonconformity of Mars in the second house. Gandhi is a great example of that. And the third thing, the decision-making versus knowledge obtaining nature of Mars in the second house. Gandhi does illustrate an intelligent person who's decisive, but he doesn't really illustrate an uneducated person who's a lawyer. So what is it about Gandhi that makes this quality of Mars in the second house not come through in his case? First and foremost, it's the mutual aspect of Jupiter, the educational planet, onto his Mars. Second of all, he also has the other educated planet, Venus, conjoining that Mars. And third of all, his Mars in the second house is his second lord, so it favors the second house topics. Another well-known person with Mars in the second house is the other very well-known civil disobedience figure, Martin Luther King. So again, he's an excellent example of non-cooperation, and also an excellent example of the ambition to surpass your family or to change your society, improve your people. And also, like Gandhi, he has a very contentious sexual life. And we talked about Mars in the second house showing great nonconformity and strength and defiance. Certainly Martin Luther King had the ability to stand up against so much. And again, also with him, the decision versus knowledge clash doesn't really produce its possible negative effect of being rash, because he's also a PhD. So he had a great deal of education. What is it in his case? It's basically a very similar thing. His Mars in the second house has a mutual aspect from Saturn, who is the ninth lord, the lord of education. And the third well-known person with Mars in the second house is Anton LaVey. Look at his Mars in the second house. It has a mutual aspect from the moon in the 8th, a very strong aspect from the 12th lord in the 12th house, Saturn, while it's in the 12th zodiac sign, Pisces. So this particular Mars in the second house is in a very mystical or occult or spiritual context. So all the things that we say about Mars in the second house that we said already in the video would manifest in that context for Anton LaVey. So in terms of his civil disobedience, it's more of a religious or spiritual contentiousness and nonconformity. And in terms of his rivalry with spouse and so forth, which is supposed to lead to sexual nonconformity, he's very sexually explorative in a sort of tantric, ritualistic context. Mars in the second house is also supposed to give us a great deal of nonconformity and strength to defy, very defiant of mainstream religion, very confident in himself. Mars in the second house is also supposed to highlight a clash between decision-making versus knowledge gathering. He is a good example because his mutual aspect to Mars is from the moon, which is also quite quick. So with Anton LaVey, you find a person building his own religion based on his own decisions and opinions, not really based on centuries and centuries of sages and so forth, but he's just gathering his experience and view from all that stuff and creating something new with a lot of confidence in the self that he has the capacity and qualification to do that. So, in conclusion, Mars in the second house signifies confidence in oneself, which enables nonconformity with one's groups, which allows one to evolve those groups, push their envelopes, but which doesn't really give a comfortable, easy relationship with those groups, and tends to put one at odds with one's own family and society. As we saw with the three different individuals we looked at, the context in which Mars is in the second house is extremely important to giving detail to those basic trends of Mars in the second house. So it's very important that you read your whole chart and not just get myopic about Mars in the second house.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
The third house is the best house for Mars. And the reason why is very obvious if you know what Mars represents and what the third house represents. So let's start with the third house. What the third house represents is very obvious if you know what it is. What it literally is the area of sky that's below ground, but on the eastern side. So because it's below ground, it represents things that are inside of us. So like emotional, mental things. But since it's on the eastern side, it represents how those inner emotional things try to become physical, pertain to physical things, and try to be realized. So we could sum up what the third house represents with the phrase expressing the interior. And so we can divide its symbolism into the internal aspect of that expression and then the external effect of that expression. So for example, the third house represents the decision-making capacity, what you set your mind on going for. And hence it has to do with confidence as well as leadership and discipline. I've made this decision, therefore I'm on this path. So decision-making determines our ambitions. We decide that this is what we want. Decisions and ambitions are related. Third house has to do with our ambitions, our lusts, our passions, our hungers. And because we're talking about the eastern side of the underground, the east pertains to self. So we're talking about the ambitions and the decisions of what I want. And so the third house is a very self-focused house. And it lends itself well towards independent decisions, independent action, and individualism. Now, those are the internal motivators of our expressions. The external effects of the expressions are strength. The third house has to do with strength, muscle power, force, how much impact we exert. Thus, it also has to do with skill, not just brute force, but skill. How well do we achieve our ambitions? How clever are we in finding out how to get what we want? And all of this has a huge role to play in how well we compete. So the third house is the house of contests, competitions, struggles, you can say, conflicts. And the people that we compete with, our competitors, the people who are our age, our siblings, our rivals, our peers. Now, this place is great for Mars. Why? It'll be obvious as soon as you understand what Mars represents. So let's take a look at Mars. The best way to organize all of Mars' symbolism is to realize that the basic thing, the foundational, fundamental thing it represents is masculinity. And masculinity has two aspects, independence and inceptivity. So Mars is a planet of independence, individuality, freedom. Therefore, Mars is the planet of self-reliance. And therefore, it's the planet of muscle, strength, power. which makes you self-reliant, which lets you be independent. And that's also why it's the planet of weapons, tools, technologies, techniques, machines, and so forth, because those are the things that amplify and multiply our strengths and powers. And Mars is the planet of conflicts, the conflict of strength. Conflicts, contentions, competitions, struggles, wars, fighting, and also the people with whom we struggle with and contest with and compete with, our siblings, our peers, our rivals. Does it sound familiar? How about this thing about masculinity being inceptive? It is the initiator of things. It starts things. And it has an ambition that doesn't like to stand still. It's passionate. It gets things moving. It's lusty. It's hungry for things. It can't wait. Therefore, it's brave and bold. It's not preparatory. It's not prudent. It's bold and ready to go, courageous, confident. And it's decisive, commanding, and dominant. So you may have noticed that Mars and the third house are almost exactly the same in what they symbolize. So things are going to look very good when we do the next step that we always do for interpreting a planet in a house, which is compare the things that they symbolize and see how those things resonate with each other. So first of all, Mars is the planet of individuality, and the third house is the house of individuality. It's the house of self-focus. That is basically a synergy between the root of what Mars symbolizes and what the third house symbolizes. So it will cause everything on that branch of independence to be harmonious and synergistic with the symbolism of the third house. Self-reliance is very synergistic with the third house. Strength is obviously very synergistic with the third house. Conflict is also what the third house represents. Dealing with competitors. So everything in that one branch is going to go well for Mars when it's in the third house. Ignoring all the other conditions like perhaps Mars has bad dignity or bad aspects, etc., etc. The other thing is that Mars was the planet of initiative, and the third house is the house of ambitions. And again, since this is the root of one of the branches of Mars's symbolism, it's going to cause that whole branch to go well with the things that the third house represents. Mars has to do with passion. Same thing with the third house, lust. Mars has to do with bravery and courage. Same thing that the third house. Mars has to do with command and decision and decisiveness. Same thing as the third house. So basically, everything on both branches of Mars' symbolic tree goes really well with what the third house symbolizes. And that is why all the classical astrologers clearly say that Mars in the third house tends to be fantastic. Now let's flesh out some of these things into particular specific words so we can understand how to interpret Mars in the third house. The synergy on the left branch of Mars' symbolism means that Mars in the third house indicates a person who is a very successful mold breaker. They break the mold. They don't have to be like other people. They can succeed and be different. In fact, their differentness from others is what makes them noteworthy, attractive, powerful. These people tend to be intelligent, especially with technology, techniques, and technicalities. And they also tend to be very ingenious in figuring out how to use tools and machinery, etc., to achieve goals and fulfill needs. So they're inventive and ingenious. People with Mars in the third house tend to be strong. You cannot dominate them. They are dominant, and they don't really need your cooperation because they're independent. Even when the odds are against them, or even when others are not cooperating with them, they still succeed. And on the other hand, the other side of Mars' symbolic tree about ambition, well, simply these people are very ambitious. It means they think big, and this is the thing that pushes them to break molds. They don't want to be stuck in the little box. They want to be more. They want to know more. They want to go further. They're bold. They're assertive. And they're brave. They're confident in their abilities. And therefore, they tend to be decision makers who take the lead and achieve dominant positions. Now, this is the theoretical view of what Mars should look like in a vacuum in the third house. Let's take it out of the vacuum now and put it into some charts and see how it actually works. So here are 4 well-known people who have Mars in the third house. Leonardo da Vinci, whose birth time is known due to a diary left by his grandfather. Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher. Kamala Harris, and Richard Ramirez, the serial killer. So all of them are very interesting in light of Mars in the third house. Leonardo da Vinci, super genius inventor. Very atypical person. How is he atypical? Besides the obvious thing that he thought in very unusual ways, he's also sexually atypical. He's a homosexual. He was philosophically, religiously atypical. He was a vegetarian, for example. He was even a fashion atypical. He was very fashion conscious, but not in current trends. He would come up with his own styles. Immanuel Kant, another super genius. Not exactly a super genius inventor, but a super genius critic, which is also very good for Mars because Mars is very cutting or slicing, or assesses the practicality of things. And this was Immanuel Kant's shtick, the practicality of philosophical ideas. He's also very atypical in his sexuality. He's basically a asexual person, not withdrawn, just liking his independence and liking his individuality and not finding a need for partnership. Kamala Harris, a very good example of Mars in the third house of somebody who's indomitable, achieves a dominant position even when the odds are against it. A mold breaker, a brave, ambitious, confident person. And Richard Ramirez, very dominant, very aggressive mold breaker in the sense of a lawbreaker. So let's take a look at his chart and find out why he's a serial killer and compare it with, let's say, Leonardo da Vinci. At first, we might think, wow, these 2 Marses in the third houses look quite the same. They're both in Aquarius, which means both of these people have Sagittarius rising, which means these Marses have the same lordships and so forth. Now, actually, they're not in the same place in Aquarius. Da Vinci's is Vargotum. But that's not really where the big truth about the difference in their chart lies. The big thing that's very different about the 2 of their charts is what's happening in the 4th house. With Da Vinci, he has Gajukeshari Yoga in his 4th house, the conjunction of Jupiter in its own sign with the moon in a quadrant. So this is a very beautiful yoga that makes a person really intelligent and learned. Mars in the 3rd house for Da Vinci exists in that context. But in Richard Ramirez's case, K2, Moon, Mercury in Pisces, days after solar eclipse. This screams insanity. This is an insane person. Mercury, the intellect, Moon, the mind, in Pisces, a very psychologically relevant sign. In the 4th house, a very emotionally relevant sign. With K2, tightly with K2, a very intensifying force right after a solar eclipse, right after Ketu was at its greatest power. And on top of that, it's exactly at the aspect point of Saturn. So you're giving cruelty to this insanity. So Mars in the third house for Richard Ramirez is in the context of this cruel insanity, whereas Mars in the third house for Leonardo da Vinci is in the context of this great learning and scholarship and wisdom.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcarrot.com/R2.
To understand Mars in the fourth house, first we will review what the fourth house symbolizes and then what Mars symbolizes. Then we can put those two together in a very intuitive, simple, but intelligent way. So to begin with, here's the fourth house. What is it actually? It's actually the spot in the sky that's right under your feet. It's like the midnight sky, the underground sky. And that is why it represents everything that it represents. That's why it's all about emotions. It's the house of happiness, mental health, peace of mind. It's also all about what's inside your heart. So it's about what you love, your quality of your love, your devotion, and so forth. Underground also means the part that you don't see. It's the sky that you don't see, right? It's underneath the earth. So it has to do with private things. So that's why it's the house of shyness, how much you keep yourself private, how modest you are, etc. And it's about your home because your home is your private space where you keep your private stuff and where it's safe and peaceful and where you can sleep and rest. The other thing about the ground beneath your feet is that the plants put their roots into it, and that's what gives them stability. The ground beneath our feet holds us up, makes us stable. The fourth house represents stability. And roots also represents ancestry. But it has to do with family, culture, roots, the things that have brought us up into being. And finally, the fourth house is the extremely feminine house because femininity is the internal gender. And so it's not really extroverted at all. It's quite introversive, introspective, and feminine. Now, if we compare that with Mars, we'll understand what Mars in the fourth house represents. So let's quickly review what Mars represents. Mars is masculinity. And masculinity has two essential symbolisms to it. One is independence, and the other is inception. So Mars is the planet that symbolizes individuality, independence, freedom. Therefore, self-reliance. Therefore, strength. And the things which make us strong. Muscles, tools, weapons, technologies, machines. Finally, because Mars is so independent, it gets into conflict with other independent beings. It's not cooperative, it's individualistic. So it signifies conflict, competition, competitors, contests, clashing, fighting. The masculinity is inceptive, so Mars represents initiative, ambition. Therefore, it's passionate, it's hungry, it's lusty, it's eager. Therefore, it's brave, it's ready to take risks, it's courageous, and it's confident. Because it's confident, it takes command. Because it can make decisions and make commitments. Now, how does that compare with what the fourth house represents? When we understand that, we will really be able to clearly, intelligently, and intuitively know what Mars in the fourth house represents. And also, not just what Mars in the fourth house represents, but what it basically means, and therefore how it would be modified by the circumstances of the chart in which it exists. So let's take a look at this. Mars is the planet of masculinity. The fourth house is the planet of femininity. we better keep that in mind when we're interpreting how Mars will do in the 4th house. Another thing we have to keep our mind on is that Mars is all about initiative and ambition, while the 4th house is all about rest, peace, safety. So Mars is risky and initiative, ambitious, but the 4th house is very cautious, safe, peaceful, quiet. So there's a clash between ambition and peace. And thirdly, Mars is all about individuality, whereas the 4th house is very group-oriented because it has to do with ancestry. So let's call this a clash between freedom and culture. In other words, it's a clash between the individual and the group. Freedom of the individual versus the values of the group or the culture. Now that we have these 3 key points of how Mars interacts with the 4th house, we can color in the picture a bit more, and we could fill out the picture a bit more. So because Mars is masculine and the 4th house is feminine, Mars in the 4th house signifies gender atypicality. So the behaviors of the base gender are not the way this person behaves, even though they belong to that gender. Exactly what that means differs based on exactly what kind of chart Mars is in the 4th house. So another way of expressing this is the quote, the right thing in the wrong place, or having inappropriate timing, because that's how it will often play out. Each gender has its own strengths and weaknesses. But if you mix them, like in Mars in the 4th house, then you can get masculinity where femininity was desired or appropriate, and femininity where masculinity was desired or appropriate. So you can get the right thing in the wrong place, or conversely, in good conditions, you can get the ability to use something inappropriate to use it effectively. We will look at some people that actually have Mars in the 4th house, and this gender atypicality will become more clear when you look at actual cases of it. The next thing about Mars in the 4th house is that Mars is ambitious, but the 4th house is very peaceful. So this is why people with Mars in the 4th house have excessive ambition, and this is probably the trademark. A lot of ambition. By which I mean big desires, big goals, big aspirations. Therefore, this person is usually not easy to satisfy or to calm down or placate. Whether you're trying to satisfy them or they're trying to satisfy themselves. Because they have a lot of hunger, and that hunger doesn't really let them come to peace or rest. It keeps driving them forward. And therefore, they often have difficulty sleeping or just relaxing or shutting down, chilling out. They'll get scared or nervous or uncomfortable when there's nothing to do. Finally, we had the clash between Mars being individualistic and the 4th house being group-oriented, which we expressed as a clash of freedom versus culture. So this is why people with Mars in the 4th house are rebellious. This is what we expect from Mars in the 4th house, rebelliousness. The individual will come away from the group, will depart from the group, will be different from the group. So the group will perceive the individual as a rebel. This individual can therefore change their group. They can alter their culture. They can change traditions. And since they like to leave the group, they tend to have interest in foreigners. They tend to get along well with foreigners. They like foreign situations. They go to foreign places. They adopt foreign ways. One example of a person with Mars in the 4th house is Boy George. Here's a clear picture of gender atypicality. Also extremely ambitious. Also extremely rebellious. Another well-known person with Mars in the 4th house, Russell Brand. Gender atypicality, you could see it a bit, but also he's very big on being kind of blunt on sophisticated things, or things where people are trying to hem and haw and beat around the bush. He'll come right up and be blunt about it. He's really blunt and in your face. So that's the idea of taking the thing which is inappropriate but still making it work, which is really making male things work in female contexts. It's also extremely ambitious and also extremely rebellious. Another well-known person is Michelangelo. Sexually atypical, whether homosexual or asexual, but definitely sexually atypical. So that's his version of gender atypicality. Extremely ambitious. He's trying to invent great things and create great things. And extremely rebellious. Very rebellious person. Finally, another example of Mars in the fourth house is Elizabeth Taylor. Her gender atypicality is how masculine she was. And very outgoing, very bold, very dominant. She's also extremely ambitious, and she's also extremely rebellious in the changing of the trends and changing of the values of the society that she's from. Let's take a look at Russell Brand. Why is he able to make the gender atypicality work for him? So he's able to take male things and use them in female settings without breaking the pottery like a bull in a china shop. He is a bull in a china shop, but the pottery benefits from it. So why is that? As I said, this is the baseline of Mars in the fourth house, but it depends on what chart it's in. So what chart is it in for Russell Brand? Well, first of all, he has Mars in the fourth house in Aries. So that means it's the fourth lord in the fourth house. The lord of a house is in its own house, and that house doesn't suffer. The house prospers. It's protected by the owner. So although in a theory, Mars in the fourth house kind of clashes with the fourth house, also in theory, the fourth lord in the fourth house benefits the fourth house. So he has both things going on. And his Mars, being the fourth lord, is exactly aspecting his Saturn, which is the first lord, which is exactly aspecting that Mars back. So there's a mutual aspect between Mars and Saturn, which is a mutual aspect between the first and the fourth lord, which is a Raj Yoga. So his Mars in the fourth house is not only his fourth lord, but it's also in Raj Yoga, which means the best combination, the best alignment of things. Furthermore, it's with Jupiter and the moon. This is why his Mars in the fourth house, he has all his qualities of Mars in the fourth house, but they all take a positive slant and make him somebody that people like, not somebody that's annoying or uncooperative. Even though he is annoying and uncooperative, etc., we like that. And Michelangelo, since he's such a great artist, we might be tempted to say, well, Michelangelo has Mars in the fourth house, so Mars in the fourth house must mean you're an artist. But it doesn't. It comes from other things. On his chart, his first lord is in the third house, along with Mercury. So it's putting a lot of emphasis on the creative side of the third house, which means the creative use of the hands. But Mercury is the 10th lord, and Jupiter is the first lord. So their combination makes Raja Yoga in the third house, which is the house of skill and talent. Then his third lord, Saturn, aspects his 11th lord in the fifth house. So those are the three key points for artists: the third house, the fifth house, the 11th house. If you watch all of my videos, you'll see every time I mention an artist, I point out those three houses. And they always have these combinations between them. So in his case, his third lord aspects his 11th lord, which is in his fifth house. He's a fantastic artist. That indicates a fantastic artist. So for Michelangelo, everything about Mars in the fourth house is true, but subordinate to the fact that he's a great artist. The first thing we think about Michelangelo is he's an artist, not he's a rebel, or not he's sexually atypical. It may be the second or third or fifth or 12th thing that we think about him. And that's, the chart shows that. The loudest thing in the chart is that he's an amazing artist, and then also that he's rebellious, etc.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
So Mars in the fifth house. 8 out of 10 times you'll be watching this video because you have it. And so you're sort of anxious to know whether it's good or bad. if it's okay with you, I will ask you to suspend that concern for the next 10 minutes, just until you get towards the end of the video. Because you can't really understand Mars in the 5th house unless you're not scared of whether or not it's good or bad. And the reason why you don't need to be scared of whether or not it's good or bad is not because there's no such thing as good or bad or any of that kind of stuff. It's because the goodness or the badness of a placement like Mars in the 5th house happens as a result of how the theoretical interpretation permutates as a result of the context that it sits in. So what we'll do in this video, first of all, is explain the theory behind how to interpret Mars in the 5th house. And then we'll look at it in a few real charts to see how the theory permutates into specific instances. So first, let's understand what the 5th house represents. Here's what it literally is. It's the western side of the underground quadrant of sky. Since it's underground, it represents internal things like ideas and feelings. And since it's to the west, it represents interaction with other people. So altogether, the 5th house represents how we exchange feelings and ideas with others. This is why it's the house of intelligence, because intelligence means how well we comprehend what's out there and comprehend what other people are saying and doing. It's also the house of compassion or sympathy, because that means the ability to feel what others are feeling. And therefore it's the house of love, which means being concerned or motivated by what other people feel. Conversely, it's the house of communication, which is converse because it's about how you can make other people understand what you're feeling and thinking. So it has to do with language, symbols, and all sorts of language formats, even numbers and so forth. It's the house of expression, how well you express yourself, which can also mean how beautifully you express yourself. So it has a lot to do with art and creativity. And the ultimate creativity is to produce a living thing. And that's also the most literal meaning of having something inside you, the underground sky, come out and become another being, the West. So it's the house of childbirth and children. Now let us try to understand Mars in the same way. The underlying root of everything that Mars symbolizes is the fact that it basically symbolizes masculinity. Masculinity has two key aspects to it. One is independence, and the other is inception. So Mars is the planet that signifies individuality, independence, and freedom. That's why it represents self-reliance, self-sufficiency. That's why it represents strength and all the things that give us strength. So not only the muscle, but also the weapons that extend the power of those muscles, or the tools, or the machines, or the technologies. And Mars represents conflict, because that's what happens when you have strength that is individualistic or independent. So it has to do with conflict, contests, competitions, violence, war. Masculinity is also inceptive, so that means Mars represents initiative, getting things started and wanting to do things. So it has to do with ambition, or we can say passion. It's our motivator. Mars gives motivation. It has lust to it. It has hunger and drive. Mars signifies bravery, because bravery is the courage and the confidence to go ahead and try, to take a risk, to get something started. And finally, Mars represents command. So Mars is a decisive planet that tells things what direction to go. Therefore, it's kind of dominant and commanding. Now, what we need to do to understand what Mars in the 5th house represents in theory is pretty simple. All we have to do is compare what Mars represents with what the 5th house represents. Mars represents conflict, but the 5th house represents compassion. Compassion means you're feeling what other people feel and you make your behavior accordingly. What conflict means, you're not feeling what other people feel, you're feeling what you feel. So that's one aspect of what's going on between Mars and the fifth house that will form a seed of how we would interpret Mars in the fifth house. And exactly how that seed will grow depends upon the soil that it's in. Another thing about Mars is that it's the planet of individuality, but the fifth house is the house of children. So how is this on the same page at all? Well, individuality means me and the self is the primary importance, whereas children means the group, the family, becomes equally important as I or more important as I. So this is really a conflict between Mars being self-oriented and the fifth house being oriented towards others. Finally, Mars is very commanding and decisive, and the fifth house is very intelligent. So these are the three seeds of what Mars means in the fifth house. Seeds grow differently depending on what soil they're in and how they're taken care of. Similarly, these three things will manifest differently depending on the chart that they're in and how Mars is affected by other planets, etc. Let's take a look at how these seeds would grow if they're just taken care of in a sort of neutral way. So Mars being the planet of conflict and the fifth house being the house of compassion, this is why we interpret Mars in the fifth house as a person who has what I would call a competitive love. This means that their way of dealing with love is almost as if it's a competition in some sort of sense, or almost as if it is something that has a reward to it other than itself. So they may be self-serving in how they love other people, or they may really want to try hard to get the best partner possible because it's like a contest, and they easily become jealous of their partner and also of other people's relationships. It's kind of negative, right? Maybe it's bad. It can be, but it depends how this seed will grow in the soil of the particular chart that it's in. Another thing that sounds kind of bad about this is that the person is not very sympathetic to others, which means that they kind of shut down their feelings when necessary so that they can just accomplish the task that they need to do. How positive or negative that is, again, depends upon the specific chart. Let's have a look at the second seed about Mars in the fifth house. Mars is self-oriented and the fifth house is oriented towards other people. This is why people with Mars in the fifth house don't like having limitations and restrictions placed on them, especially as a result of the partnerships that they enter. And this is why they don't like to enter partnerships, or they're very selective about who they'll partner with. They want to partner with a person that will definitely give them the space to remain the individual who they are and pursue the ambitions that they have. They tend to not want to have the responsibility of having to take care of kids and raise kids. Or they may have physical limitations on the ability to have kids. And then the third thing about Mars in the fifth is that Mars is very commanding or decisive, and the fifth is very intelligent. So that's why we expect people with Mars in the fifth house to be intelligent and have a quick, decisive way of thinking. And particularly, they can figure out how to get what they want or how to know what they want to know. So they're very good at strategizing and making plans. Now, I've been talking a lot about context, etc. Let's turn the book to that page. Let's bring up some well-known people who have Mars in fifth house and see how these basic seeds permutate in their chart. So 4 people to quickly mention. Walt Disney. Just think about him and how he relates with these ideas. Priyanka Chopra, Candy Bar, and Sri Chaitanya. Now let's take a more careful look at another 4 people. Jim Morrison. Kind of classic in terms of competitive love, disliking restrictions and limits, wanting freedom, and being very intellectual. One thing about Jim Morrison's chart is Mars is in Gemini in the fifth house. And so that kind of soil of Gemini would make the intellectual implication of Mars in the fifth grow more luxuriously than the other two implications. But another question is, how come Jim Morrison is seen as like a sex symbol, which means people like his lustiness? Well, in his chart, his Mars is his 10th lord, and it's conjoined to Saturn, which is his first lord. So you have a conjunction in the fifth house of the lord of a trine and the lord of a quadrant, which makes Raj Yoga, which means the best combination that you can get. So under those conditions, the same seed, it doesn't grow to be a different flower, but it grows to be a flower that people like, a version of itself that people like. Let's take a look at a few more people. Carl Sagan. His Mars in the fifth house is in Virgo. That makes a lot of sense for an intellectual. And he's a great communicator. That also makes sense with Virgo. And also because his Mars in the fifth house is also in Raja Yoga, by virtue of it forming a house exchange with the seventh. And the seventh has a lot to do with communication. How you interact with other people. But the really interesting thing about Carl Sagan is that he's born within 3 days of another very famous person with Mars in the fifth house, Charles Manson. And so their charts look almost exactly the same because they happen to have the same rising sign as well. So this is rather startling, and the only thing that's really obviously different is the position of the moon, which is very, very important in Charles Manson's case, because his moon is not just somewhere else other than where Sagan's is. His moon is exactly conjoined Rahu, which makes him extremely mentally unstable and rebellious. That does go a long way towards describing the difference between Sagan and Manson, but you really have to look at their Navamshas to be able to tell the difference between them. They're quite different. Carl Sagan's is very dominated by Jupiter and Mercury, and so it's very intellectual in its flavor. Whereas Manson's is Saturnian in nature, and it has Mars across from the moon, adjunct to Ketu and Rahu. So it's very violent. And that does really furnish the complete description of the difference between both of these expert thinkers and strategists. But one is quite antisocial and violent, and the other is quite research-oriented. There is one other well-known criminal with Mars in the fifth house, and that's Ted Bundy. It's not that Mars in the fifth house produces criminals, but that sense of disliking restrictions and also having a self-focus in love can be an important part of the recipe that makes somebody move towards criminality. But you see, the soil has to be right. Like in Manson's case, we had to have a very destabilized moon. And in Ted Bundy's case, you have to put it right next to Ketu. You have to put that Mars in the fifth house right next to Ketu, while Ketu is performing a solar eclipse. So hopefully this clarifies how important it is to take into account the whole chart when you're trying to see what Mars in the fifth house or any planet in any house actually means to you. Also, please take care that you're calculating Mars in the fifth house in the traditional manner, which means use tropical zodiac signs and use a whole sign house system, not a dynamic system.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
Mars and the sixth house. Well, there's two parts to this puzzle. Mars and the sixth house. If you're clear about what each of them means separately, then it'll be much easier to be clear about what they mean together. So, this is the sixth house. It's the part of the sky that's in the western section, but on the lower border. So it's the part of the sky that's just below the western horizon. Everything about the sixth house comes from the fact that it's under the west, and the west is where the sun sets. So the sixth house signifies things that support or hold up the sunset. And since the sunset symbolizes disappearance and other people, this is where we get all the specific meanings of the sixth house. For example, it's the house of enemies, enmity, fighting, contest, struggle. Because it's the house that supports other people. Being pro someone else implies being anti you. It's also why this is the house of debts and how we are indebted to people, the chores that we have to perform, the work that we have to do, the service that we do for others. In other words, it's about the way our money and our work benefit other people more than it benefits us. So it can have to do with the whole spectrum of things depending on how good the sixth house is doing. A spectrum can range from stuff like exploitation, slavery, to employment, to volunteer service. Now, how about the fact that the sunset represents disappearance? And disappearance means death. So that's why the sixth house supporting the sunset is the house of things that support or lead to death. That's why it's the house of illness. Disappearance also means not being able to see something or losing something. So the sixth house represents things that lead to losing or not obtaining things. So it has to do with uncertainty, doubt, confusion, and problems. Now that is what we need to know about the sixth house to be able to understand Mars in the sixth house. But we should also get our bearings straight about what Mars itself represents. Mars fundamentally represents masculinity, and masculinity has two facets to it: independence and inceptivity. So Mars symbolizes everything which is all about independence, individuality, and freedom. This is why it symbolizes self-reliance, the capacity to be independent. And this is why it symbolizes strength, what you need to be self-reliant, which is what you need to be independent. And this is why Mars has everything to do with stuff that makes us stronger. So muscle is one thing, but also weapons, things that extend the strength. Also tools, also machines and technologies. And Mars signifies conflict because it's all about strong, self-reliant, independent, individualistic people. So in circles with different centers overlap each other and clash. So Mars has to do with clashing between people and conflicting. Besides being independent, masculinity is also inceptive. This is why Mars is the planet of initiative. It has a lot of ambition and it wants to do things now. And that's why Mars symbolizes passion and lust and hunger and all the motivations to do it. And this is why Mars is brave. Bravery, courage, confidence means I am willing to take that risky first step to get something started, to get what I want. And finally, Mars represents command, because command is actually the outcome of confidence. So Mars has a very dominant, decisive nature, decisive as a result of confidence, not necessarily as a result of learning, scholarship, or intelligence. Now, we understand the sixth house, and we understand Mars, and what I promised was if you understand the two of those, you should be able to make sense of Mars in the sixth house. So let's see if I can follow through on that promise. All that we need to do is put the symbolism of Mars side by side with the symbolism of the sixth house and ask ourselves where they are talking about the same thing or exactly the opposite thing. For example, Mars is all about conflict. It symbolizes conflict. And the sixth house symbolizes fighting because it has to do with dealing with enemies and dealing with problems. So Mars really fits well in the sixth house because it's a masculine, strong, independent, conflict, comfortable planet. conflict enjoying planet in a place where it will be presented with many conflicts and many problems to solve and many enemies to defeat. So basically, Mars is the perfect match for the 6th house. Mars also represents decisions, and the 6th house represents problems, things that you have to make decisions about and take action on. So again, Mars is the planet that likes to solve a problem, make a decision, conquer an enemy, conquer a problem, and it's in the 6th house where it's going to have a lot of opportunity to do that. Finally, Mars represents freedom, but the 6th house represented being exploited, being put into servitude and slavery. So now here's an example where they're talking about opposite things. Mars is all about freedom, and the 6th house is all about servitude, slavery. But in light of the context of how well Mars is doing with solving the problems of the 6th house and overcoming the enemies that are there, it will probably symbolize something good about freedom versus slavery. So now let's take those 3 seeds of what Mars in the 6th house represents and sprout them a little bit so we can see what they look like in a basic sentence or in basic words. In order to fully get the fruit out of these seeds, we need to put them into a complete chart to understand the whole soil of the whole chart. But to get an initial sprout of meaning out of these 3 seeds, we can still just stick with the theory of what Mars in the 5th house represents in a void of context. So Mars is conflict and the 5th house is fighting. This is great. This is a good seed. Something about this person is going to enjoy conquering their opponents. So what does that look like as a sprout of an interpretation? Well, here's a strong person. Here's a dominant person, a victorious person, a capable person, a person who's capable of dealing with problems, capable of dealing with enemies. They don't shrink in the face of danger, in the face of opposition. They are actually independent and self-reliant, and on their own, they can overcome a lot of challenges. Another thing is Mars makes decisions, and the 6th house presents problems. What does that seed look like when it starts to sprout? It looks like a confident person. It looks like a person who doesn't get paralyzed when there's choices to make. It looks like a person who makes decisions and therefore doesn't hesitate. They're active. They're quick. They make a choice and they get to it. Therefore, they wind up in the front of the pack. They wind up leading other people. Mars is all about freedom, and the 6th house is about slavery. But since Mars is doing so good in the 6th house, the seed will probably grow well also. So these are people who don't succumb to domination, and they don't succumb to slavery and servitude and exploitation. They're individualistic, they're free, unbound, and they're unique people. Who are some people who are well known with confirmed birth times, with tropical signs and whole sign houses, who have Mars in the 6th house? How about Lionel Messi and Karl Marx? They really put a good face on all of these traits, but especially on the dominant, capable, independent, strong aspect of Mars in the 6th house. How about Copernicus, Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, and Edgar Cayce? These are people with an interesting intellect. These are really confident people who do things very differently and think very differently from others. How about Frida Kahlo, Jack Black, and Hugh Hefner? Of course, they all exemplify all these qualities of Mars in the 6th, but I particularly feel like These three exemplify the freedom versus slavery aspect. They're very individualistic. They're very free and unbound by conventions. Now, Copernicus is a genius, right? And Edgar Cayce is a psychic. So maybe we should find some way to fit in here that Mars in the 6th makes you a genius and a psychic. Don't do that. Don't work backwards from the person to the chart. Work from the chart to the person. Let's look at these two individuals and see why they are what they are and why Mars in the 6th isn't the major factor contributing to those things about them. Copernicus. Why is he a genius? Is it Mars in the 6th house? Not really. It's more like he's got a Virgo ascendant. Isn't that simple? And on top of the Virgo ascendant, he has Mercury, the first lord, aspecting the ascendant while in a Neech Bhang Raj Yoga, which means its debilitation has been reversed as a result of conjunction with exalted Venus, who is the 9th lord. So he's got an extremely profound first house and first lord Virgo and Mercury. There is your textbook smart person. Furthermore, his 5th lord, which is really important for understanding somebody's intelligence, his 5th lord aspects that Mercury from Gemini in the 10th house. And it also aspects his moon. The 5th lord aspects his moon from Gemini, and it also mutually aspects his planet of wisdom and learning, Jupiter. So that whole context of that whole chart explains why Copernicus is a genius. It's not reliant on his Mars in the 6th house. Mars in the 6th house is why he was unique, individualistic, and went against the grain. Caused a revolution. Edgar Cayce, he's a psychic. Why is he a psychic? It's not about Mars in the 6th house. Look at this chart. It's like an 8th house extravaganza. So that explains that. Furthermore, his 8th lord is in Neech Bhang Raja Yoga, just with that Mars in the 6th house, and his exalted moon is the only planet that is in the central position. So that explains why he's a psychic. It doesn't have to do with his Mars in the 6th house, but Mars in the 6th house made him not succumb to norms, not succumb to conventions, not become a part of the mainstream.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
Mars in the 7th house. Many of you will be watching this video because you have Mars in the 7th house, or you think you have Mars in the 7th house, and therefore many of you are sort of maybe worried whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, and you might even want to judge my video based on whether or not I say it's a good thing or a bad thing. If possible, suspend that concern until we get to the part about reading charts. First, just don't worry about the fact that you have it, and just learn what it is. Okay? So in order to know what it is, there's two parts to the puzzle. There's Mars and there's the 7th house. So we should understand each one individually, and then it will be much easier to combine them together. So this is the 7th house. It literally is the area of sky that's immediately around the western horizon. So that is why it symbolizes everything it symbolizes, because the western horizon is where the sun sets, and sunset represents disappearance, and sunset represents other people, because the sun or the self is declining. From this information, we can make sense of the fact that the 7th house is called the house of endings, destinations, and death. It is a place of the dispersion and disappearance and the movement of things, or travel. It has to do with other people, so this is the most famous thing about the 7th house, is that it has to do with partnerships, especially marriage. But any kind of intercourse, even sex, but also cooperation, like exchanging things, trading things, and doing commerce. That's the basic structure of the 7th house. Now, do the same thing for Mars, and then you'll be ready to interpret Mars in the 7th house. So Mars represents masculinity, and masculinity has two aspects: independence and inception. So Mars represents individuality, independence, freedom, and that's why it also represents self-reliance, which is the capacity to be independent, and that's why it represents strength, which is what you need to be self-reliant, to be independent, and that's why it represents the things that make us strong. So obviously one of the things is muscle, but other things also make you strong, like weapons or tools or machines or any kind of technology. Because Mars is independent and strong, however, it gets into conflict with other people who are independent. So Mars represents conflict, contest, competition, competitiveness, competitors, and struggles. Now, masculinity is not just independent, it's also inceptive. This is why Mars has a lot of initiative. It represents initiative. It represents ambition, motivation. Therefore, it's full of passion, lust, and hunger, the driving forces that motivate us to do stuff. That's why it represents bravery, courage, and confidence, because that is the ability to take the risk, to take the first step towards what you want. And Mars signifies the ability to make those decisions and take command. And command and decision making is actually an outcome of confidence, not necessarily learning or education or knowledge. So Mars represents the confidence to make decisions, take command, and be in a dominant position. That's everything we need to know about Mars. We already know what we need to know about the 7th house. To understand Mars in the 7th house, now just put the two side by side and see where they're on the same page or where they are antithetical to each other. For example, Mars is all about individuality, but the 7th house is all about partnership, so they're antithetical. Mars is all about passion. Passion is something that makes you move, motivation. And the 7th house is about travel, which is what happens when you're motivated. So here, they're actually on the same page. Because Mars is the motivator of action and 7 is the destination of action. And the third example is that Mars is very dominant and commanding, and the 7th house is about exchange. So exchange means transference of things between peers, but Mars is very dominant in its nature. It's not peer oriented, it competes with peers. So here they're antithetical again. Now what we have here are 3 seeds. Some of the seeds look like they'll probably make a more tasty fruit than others. So you might be starting to get your worry again about whether or not Mars in the 7th is good or bad, or if it means you're a good person or a bad person. But still hold on to that, because we want to see these seeds sprout. And in order to know how they sprout, we need to know what soil they're growing in. To know the soil truly, we must know the whole chart. Okay, but before we go and look at some specific instances of charts with Mars in the 7th house, let's just sprout the seed a little bit on its own and see what kind of initial sprouts come out. So Mars is all about individuality and the 7th house is all about partnership. So what sprouts from that? Here's a person that is not like their group. In fact, they may not like their groups, so they may be, or they probably are, rebellious. And another way of looking at that is maybe they're difficult to get along with, or they have difficulty getting along with others, so you could call that antisocial. The other seed is that Mars is passionate and the 7th house is emotional. So this seed sprouts into an ambitious person, a person who likes to move a lot, a person who always has motivation to do something. So they're not prone to settle down. Rather, they always pursue something. And the third seed of Mars in the 7th house is that Mars is very dominant, but the 7th house is very exchangey or peer-oriented. So this sprouts into the idea of a person who's quite dominant, in the sense of not necessarily being very tactful or respectful. Let's see some people now. As I said, we want to see how these sprouts fare in different types of soils or different types of charts. So let's bring in some actual people with confirmed birth times, with tropical zodiac signs in a whole sign house system. Malcolm X and John Lennon. Very good example of all of these qualities, but especially of being rebellious. Einstein, Fermi, and Steven Spielberg. Good examples of all of them, maybe particularly of always pursuing something, always having a new project, always having a new thing that they have to do and accomplish. Another three people, Charles Bukowski, Jeffrey Dahmer, and Ramchandra. Again, they exemplify many or all of these traits, but probably especially the dominance. Now, how about Ramchandra? His dominance is quite positive in that he was one of the world's history's most famous kings. He's kind of like the example for a king and what a king should do and be like. So why is he there right next to Jeffrey Dahmer, who's dominant and not respectful and not tactful? Ram was quite tactful, quite respectful, but dominant. Why don't we take a look at that soil of that chart? And why don't we also look at Einstein, because Einstein is a genius. So does Mars in the 7th house. Actually, maybe we should say somehow that it makes you a genius. Let's take a look at Einstein first. The reason why Einstein is a genius, or what indicates Einstein being as a genius, is not that he has Mars in the 7th house, but rather, first of all, that his first lord moon is in Sagittarius. That's the beginning. Second thing is that his 5th lord is Mars. And his 7th house is Capricorn. So Mars in Capricorn is exalted, so it means his 5th lord, lord of intelligence, is exalted. And furthermore, it's in Neech Bhang Raj Yoga, by virtue of its house exchange with the debilitated Saturn, who is the owner of Capricorn. Finally, the planet of intellect, Mercury, is conjoined to that very extreme Raja Yoga. So that is the soil that shows an intelligent person. Mars in the 7th house gives Einstein other things and gives him his rebelliousness, difficultness to get along with his antisocialness, and gives him his uniqueness. And how about Ramchandra? He's not disrespectful at all. Well, he does have some questionable attitude towards marriage. And that is what Mars in the 7th house tends to indicate, right? Because it's individuality clashing with partnership. But for Ramchandra, almost all of these traits take place in a soil or a context which is extremely moral. So look, his first lord moon is domicile with the 9th lord Jupiter, who is exalted. There you go. That is your major bell ringer for an extremely moral person. In that context, you have Mars in the 7th house. But there's more. His 4th lord, Venus, is exalted in his 9th house, house of morality. Furthermore, his Mars in the 7th house is also exalted like Einstein's, and it's aspected by the 9th lord, exalted Jupiter. So hopefully you see how important it is to know the whole context of your chart before you go into that difficult realm of asking yourself what things about me are positive and I should accentuate, and what things about me are negative and I should try to downplay.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
To understand Mars in the 8th house, first understand what the 8th house symbolizes. Then understand what Mars symbolizes, and then you'll have a pretty easy time figuring out what they mean when they're together. So let's start with the 8th house. Here it is. It's the area of sky that's right over the western horizon. So it's the wind, the rain, the clouds, etc. that affect the ground below it. So it signifies the erosion of the west, and the west represents disappearance and other people because it's where the sun sets. The 8th house, it is the house of mysticism, the house of the occult, psychic things, intuition. Why? Because it's about the ability to erode the invisibility. It's about the ability to see things which are invisible. And that's what mysticism is all about. And that's what occult is all about, looking into the unknown, looking into the taboo, going into the forbidden. That's the nature of the 8th house. It's also the house of insight, putting your eyes into the places that are invisible, researching into the depths of things, analyzing things, pulling things apart, opening them up, finding out what's inside, and therefore being able to critique things and cut them to pieces. It's the house of anti-disappearance. That also means anti-death. That's why it's the house of vitality, life force, reproduction, and sex. But remember, this interesting kind of double negative way of talking about this is important to the symbolism of the 8th house. It's anti-death. That means it has to do with death. And the quality of this 8th house is going to affect death and the lifespan. As for the theme of being erosive of others, the 8th house is all about personal gains, what we can get from other people. So it has to do with inheritances, especially because that's also connected with the theme of death. But it also has to do with gifts, donations, and it even has to do with sales and knowing how to earn money. Being anti-others also means being highly individualistic, not being group-oriented. So the 8th house is a place of individuality, defiance of norms, defiance of group values, non-conformity with mainstream things. Now let's see how Mars works when it's in this house. So the root of everything that Mars symbolizes is masculinity. Just like we get everything about the 8th house from the fact that it erodes the west, we get everything about Mars from the fact that it represents masculinity. Masculinity is independent and masculinity is inceptive. Explore those two themes and you'll understand Mars. Mars represents individuality, independence, and freedom. It represents self-reliance because you need to be self-reliant to be independent. It represents strength because you need strength to be self-reliant. And under this umbrella, it represents things that make you strong. So it represents exercise, it represents muscles, but it also represents tools, weapons, machines, technologies. And also, finally, because it's independent, it's not cooperative. Rather, it's competitive, and therefore it gets into conflicts and has contests. Now, masculinity is also inceptive, and therefore Mars represents initiative, ambition, motivation, the things that get things started. And that's why it represents passion, because that's what gets things started. Passion is motivation. It represents lust. It represents hunger. It represents drive. And that's why it represents bravery, courage, and confidence, because you cannot embrace a lust without bravery. You cannot embrace a desire without courage. You cannot set out to pursue an ambition without confidence. Finally, Mars represents command, because command is really just an outcome of confidence. Setting the direction in which things will go requires confidence. So Mars represents command, dominance, and decision making. Now that we're clear about Mars and clear about the 8th house, it's relatively easy to intuit what Mars represents if it's in the 8th house. All you need to do is put the two symbolic trees side by side and look at them for a second and let the resonance between them just jump out at you. For example, Mars represents individuality and the 8th house represents individuality. So I'm sure Mars in the 8th house has something really important to say about individuality. Another example is that Mars represents lust and the 8th house has to do with sex. So I bet you Mars in the 8th house has something to do with putting lust and sex together. Mars is all about strength. The 8th house is all about virility, vitality. So I bet Mars in the 8th house has to do with that too. The combination of these 6 principles form the 3 seeds that will sprout and grow into the actual interpretation of what Mars in the 8th house means. You have to know that seeds grow in soil, they don't grow in a vacuum. And the quality of the soil affects the way the seed grows tremendously. And the quality of the soil affects tremendously how the seed grows. So in this analogy, the soil here is all the rest of the things in the chart, especially the things that are directly affecting Mars, are going to have a huge influence on the way these 3 seeds grow. But we can look at how they would grow in neutral average soil. So the thing about individuality from both Mars and the 8th house, these people with Mars in the 8th house, they're real individuals. They really stand out in a crowd. They don't fit in because they don't conform. They will tend to disagree with most people, disagree about how things should be done, and therefore do things in their own way. And they tend to be trailblazers, or they have the potential to be trailblazers or trendsetters. The thing about lust and sex from Mars in the 8th house, well, people with Mars in the 8th house probably have a high libido. They're libidinous, they're passionate, they're hot-blooded. And the thing about strength and vitality, well, these people are probably strong, especially in the will, the decisiveness, highly decisive, strongly decisive. It comes out as them being hyper-committed to things. They become extreme about their pursuits. They prefer to dedicate everything. So they kind of fit this popular phrase of live fast, die young. So even though the strength and the vitality might seem to promote a long life, it actually promotes a hyper commitment where they sacrifice all their energy right away. So as I said, this is the way that these 3 seeds of Mars in the 8th house would grow in unremarkable soil. If there's some remarkable influence on Mars in the 8th house, these seeds will still be the same seeds, but they will grow a little bit differently. They'll grow under the influence of whatever is influencing them. So let's take it out of the theoretical box a bit and look at some actual faces of real people who have Mars in the 8th house. I have a small database of people with known birth times, and from that small database, there's a lot of people with Mars in the 8th house. And that just goes to show how they do stand out. And they do tend to set new trends. So they become remarkable. There's Barack Obama, Steve Jobs, Adolf Hitler. Very big leaders, thinkers, trendsetters, people who do things differently, people who mark the beginning of a different era. Then we have Osho, Marilyn Monroe, and Tracy Lords. 3 examples, particularly of the libidinous side of Mars in the 8th house. And then we have philosophers like Paramahansa Yogananda, Ramana Maharshi, and René Guénon. And there's even more names from the database. There's 2 other important people, Aretha Franklin and Benito Mussolini. What a crop of people. It's interesting to look at these people and then look at the expected interpretations of Mars in the 8th house and see how those seeds grew pretty close to how they were expected to grow in each one of these people. But you can see there's a high variance. And I think the most dramatic variance is between like the sex symbol types or the sex-oriented people, like Marilyn Monroe, Tracy Lords, and even Osho, or formerly known as Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, versus the kind of renunciate or philosophical type like Paramahansa Yogananda, Ramana Maharshi, and Rene Guénon. So let's talk about now soil of charts and how the soil will affect the growth of a seed of something like Mars in the 8th house. Let's take a look at these highly sexual people, the sex symbol type people, and see what makes them different from the highly renunciate or philosophical type of people. So here's Tracy Lords. Here you can see that the first Lord is in a sexual house. It's in the 8th house. On top of that, she has Ketu in the 1st house. And that's going to count for something, right? It's going to really enhance the maverickness or the unusualness of the person, which is also potential in Mars in the 8th house. Besides that, she has 2 sexual lords with the 8th lord in the 8th house, the Lord of the 11th and the Lord of the 7th. So it's really bringing out the sexual side of what's going on in the 8th house for Tracy Lords. And besides that, she has the 5th lord debilitated in the 7th house as Saturn, which is a really intense debilitation, right next to Rahu. Then you have Marilyn Monroe. Here's her chart. Again, the 1st lord is in the sexual house. It's in the 11th house, and it's with the 11th lord, a sexual lord. And it's aspected by the 8th lord. So the chart, again, has a very sexual soil to it. And so Mars in the 8th house, that part of that seed can flourish. The 8th lord is also in a sexual house with the moon, the planet of desire. And the 7th house has 2 Dustana lords, right? The 7th house has the moon, the 12th lord, and Jupiter, the 8th lord. So it's kind of has a similar flavor, not nearly as extreme, but a similar flavor as Tracy Lords having a debilitated Saturn, the 5th lord, in her 7th house with Rahu. Now let's take a look at Osho Rajneesh, the sex guru. Here's his chart. Practically has everything in the 8th house. So just note that in this 8th house also is the 8th lord, and the Mars in this 8th house is exalted. So now let's compare these 3 charts to the 3 philosophical, not very sexual, not very libidinous people at all. So let's look at Ramana Maharshi. His 1st lord is not in a sexual house. His 5th lord, Saturn, is debilitated in the 7th, just like Tracy Lords. But all that other stuff that Tracy Lords has going on is not going on in his chart. So here we can see the seed of debilitated Saturn in the 7th house. It means something is very strange with relationships. But because in Tracy Lord's chart, where the context is highly sexualized, and where Rahu is very present with that 7th house debilitation, then that means a porn star, a person who's really wild with their sexual behavior. But in Ramana Maharshi's chart, with a debilitated planet in the 7th house and the rest of the chart is not sexually charged, then that means no sexual activity. Also, his 8th house is really good because it's in an exchange with the 2nd house. So house exchanges are really positive, and that 8th lord exactly aspects the 8th house, so it's really fortifying and protecting the 8th house. Let's take a look at Paramahansa Yogananda. In his chart, we see that the 1st lord is also not in a sexual house, and also on top of that, it's in Sagittarius with the 9th lord. So the 9th lord is Raja Yoga with the 1st lord in Sagittarius, the 4th house. This is a very wholesome chart. Well, on top of that, his 11th lord, the sexual lord, is in the 12th house, renunciation. And the 8th lord is in the 8th house with Jupiter, so the 8th house is doing good. It even has the 8th lord in the 8th house. So this 8th house is dignified. So this chart is not highly libidinous at all. And so, although Mars in the 8th house has a potential, that doesn't really go anywhere with this person because the rest of the chart doesn't support it. It's like putting a seed in the wrong kind of soil. It doesn't really grow. Now, Rene Guénon, here's his chart. He does have the first lord in a sexual house, the seventh house, but it is in Sagittarius. And moreover, we find that the eighth lord aspects the eighth house exactly. So the eighth house is really doing well. And Mars in this house is exalted, kind of like Osho. So if we sort all this out, we can see the differences between the sex archetypes and the non-sex archetypes. They both have Mars in the eighth house. For the sex archetypes, one of the key things is that the whole chart is very sexually activated. And for the non-sexual archetypes, the whole chart doesn't have a sexual context. And so that's what I mean about different types of soil. The other thing about the sex archetypes is that there isn't really anything especially dignified about their Mars in the eighth house. And sexual behavior is very raw, isn't it? It's not very dignified. It's very instinctual. Dignity and all that kind of stuff doesn't really lead to pronounced or extreme sexual behavior. It may lead to very excellent sexual experience, but not really pronounced, prolific sexual behavior. So in those charts, we didn't find Mars in the eighth house in a particularly great dignity, and we didn't find that the eighth house was particularly protected or blessed in any way. But in the non-sexual archetypes, we had Mars in very good dignities, and we had the eighth lord keeping contact with the eighth house and therefore protecting it. So we can place these six people that we looked at on the spectrum. We would put Tracy Lord's hard left. Her chart is the most sexually charged besides Mars in the eighth house. And a little bit to the right of that, we would put Marilyn. And to the hard right, we would put Paramahansa Yogananda, and a little bit to the left of that, Ramana Maharshi. Because their charts are really morality, philosophy, renunciation oriented. And then more towards the middle, we'll put Osho and Rene Guénon. We'll put Rene Guénon is to the right of the middle, more towards the non-sexual, and Osho is to the left, pretty hard to the left.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
Mars in the ninth house. To understand it, let's review what the ninth house symbolizes. This is the ninth house. It's the area of sky that is above our heads, yet to the western edge of what's above your head. So since it's above our head, it has to do with what that part of the sky symbolizes, which is public life. And since it's to the west, it has to do with what that part of the sky symbolizes, which is other people. So it's about how our public actions affect other people. This is why it has to do with our values and our integrity. That's why it's the house of philosophy, religion, ethics, morals, laws, stuff like that. Because what are laws? What are morals? What are philosophies? What are religions? Collections of values, the way we should treat other people. It's also the house of education. The kind of education that the ninth house is about the transference of values and morals. And that's in turn why the ninth is the house of educators. Teachers, elders, role models, guides, gurus, priests, older people in your family, more experienced people in your family, more experienced people in your world. On the other spine, the ninth house signifies things that have to do with integrity, which means how well do you live up to your philosophy. So it's known as the house of good deeds. And it's also known as the house of good luck, because luck is the result of action. Outcome is the result of action. And so the house which represents good deeds must also represent good results. In other words, good luck, good fortune, prosperity. Now that we've reviewed the ninth house, to understand Mars in the ninth house, let's next review what Mars represents. Basically, everything about Mars roots to the fact that it symbolizes masculinity. And masculinity has two key aspects. It's independent and it's inceptive. So Mars signifies individuality, freedom, independence. And that's why it signifies self-reliance. Self-reliance is the ability to be independent. And that's why it signifies strength. Strength is what you need to be self-reliant, and self-reliance is what you need to be independent. Furthermore, under the umbrella of signifying strength, Mars signifies everything that gives or extends our strength. Muscles, exercise, tools, weapons, machines, technologies, and also Mars signifies conflict, contest, competition, warfare, struggle. Because it's about independent people, not cooperative people. Masculinity, besides being independent, it's also inceptive, and that's why Mars is a planet that symbolizes initiative and ambition. It's not a patient planet, it gets things started right away. Mars symbolizes passion, which is the drive to get things started. And so every kind of term that could fit under the umbrella of passion applies here. Lust, zeal, enthusiasm, hunger, drive. Mars symbolizes bravery, courage, and confidence because that's what you need to be able to act upon your passions. And finally, Mars symbolizes command, dominance, and decision-making capability. Because that's what happens if you're courageous and confident. When you're courageous and confident, then you're not afraid to make a decision, choose between A and B, take a risk, and follow it. Now we've reviewed what the ninth house symbolizes. We've reviewed what Mars symbolizes. You're ready to figure out what Mars in the ninth house represents. And now that you did that little review work, it's actually not going to be that hard. All you need to do is look at the two symbolic trees side by side and see where they're on the same page or very off the same page. So for example, the ninth is the house of philosophy. So we can say that the ninth house symbolizes rules. But on the other hand, Mars is a planet of freedom. So here's an example where they're off the same page. And that is one of the key things about Mars in the ninth house that you have to envision in order to interpret Mars in this house. I'll call this a seed of an interpretation. You need to let that seed grow in your mind, considering the soil around that seed. And that soil is provided by the conditions that Mars is in that ninth house, as well as the conditions prevailing in the rest of the chart. We will explore this in more detail in this very video. But now let's move on to look at the other two seeds. The ninth is the house of educators and teachers and elders and everything, so it represents father figures, role models, people that give you the definitions of what's right and wrong. Whereas Mars, once again, is all about individuality and freedom. So again, it's off the page with the ninth house. Mars is all about having freedom, but the ninth house is about the people who set rules, like fathers, priests, gurus, teachers. So that's another seed that we'll have to consider. And the third seed comes from the fact that the ninth house has to do with good deeds and it's oriented towards your actions, towards society. Whereas Mars, once again, it's all about individuality. It's a solo planet. So we have three seeds where Mars is off the page with the house that it's occupying. Let's figure out how to grow these seeds into interpretations. But please bear in mind that the exact permutation of the interpretation will differ depending on the exact soil that these seeds are growing in, which is different from one chart to the next, from one individual to the next. So let's take a look at how these seeds would grow basically, unmodified by any soil. The first thing about freedom versus rules. Well, Mars would like to be the order giver, but the ninth house also wants to be the order giver, the rule maker. Mars in the ninth house is being asked to follow. And that request is against Mars's basic instinct in nature, which is to lead. So that's why the classic texts like Paladipika say, that Mars in the ninth house is represented by Nripa Dvesha, which means Mars hates the king. So Mars in the ninth house will always try to break traditions, rules, and boundaries, especially those that put any practical limitation on its ambitions. Mars is also quite practical or utilitarian, so it will just live and let live if these rules don't affect me. But once this rule tries to come in and limit my ability to be a unique, free individual, then I will really not be comfortable submitting to it. That's Mars in the ninth house talking. On the other hand, the same texts that say Nripa Dvesh, the full statement is Nripa Suridapi Dvesha, which means Mars in the ninth house either loves or hates the king. So it means sometimes in some configurations, Mars feels exactly the opposite. It loves the order giver. So Mars, being an order giver itself, does value orders and is therefore capable of respecting orders and law. But to get Mars to behave in that way takes some influence on Mars, especially from Jupiter or the sun. So if you have Mars in the ninth house with that kind of influence from Jupiter or the sun, then the seed of rules and order giver is what grows instead of the clash between freedom and rules. So here you find a Mars that has an innate respect for tradition, morality, ethics, and law, and wants to help enforce those things. So it tries to put itself in a position of a police or an enforcer or a military person. But it will still be very individualistic and clear-cut about which king it follows. It respects its king and fights against the other ones. Now, let's look at the second seed of Mars in the ninth house, which is really just a permutation on the first one. Now, instead of freedom versus rules, it's freedom versus the rule giver. So this seed is just going to talk more about the relationship that the Mars in the ninth house individual has with the people in their life who are trying to set rules and limits. So texts like Paladipika describe Mars in the ninth as atata, which means they're fatherless. The actual meaning of this, of course, depends upon the exact soil that the seed is growing in. It can range from anything from being abandoned or worse by like a self-obsessed father. It can range from that all the way to just early loss of a father or separation of an otherwise good father. And it can also range into the general lack or discomfort with father figures and people who try to establish boundaries on the individual. So Mars in the ninth house really is very sensitive to being indoctrinated. It easily feels like it's being indoctrinated or programmed and resists against that. It doesn't like dogma. So just like we can say Mars in the ninth house has a tendency to be fatherless, we could also put that as teacherless. They like to find out the truth and figure out the truth on their own, even if it means that it will take them 40 times longer. But again, just as the previous seed can also have a flip side, here, because Mars also gives orders, it can also have a lot of respect for people that give instructions and teachers. So with some good influence, especially from Jupiter, you can find Mars being very passionately dedicated to specific teachings and teachers. The third and final seed about Mars in the ninth house is the individuality of Mars versus the social nature of the ninth house. And classics like Paladipika describe this as Janagartaka. So it kind of means like leaving the herd. So this can involve physical distance from the homeland or just in general adoption of non-conventional, non-mainstream behavior, philosophy, ways of living. It also tends to indicate that you get shunned by your social groups, or you don't like your own social groups and you willingly leave them. Now let's talk about how these seeds might be affected in different kinds of soil. It means when this Mars is under different influences and in different charts. And there's no better way to do that than by actually looking at some charts. When you look at charts trying to learn about planets and houses, you make sure that you, number one, have a very verified birth time. The Rodin rating on the birth time should be AA. Make sure that you're calculating the chart the same way that the person you're learning from is. So the classical way and the way that I do it is tropical zodiac with whole sign houses. And one such example of a person well known with Mars in the ninth is Vincent van Gogh. One very conspicuous thing about Vincent van Gogh is that he felt abandoned by his parents. He also very much disliked formal education, and he really hated the rules and customs, especially rules and customs that apply to art. So we find in Vincent van Gogh a person who really fits the description of atata, lack of father, and also of being averse to rules, nirpatvesh. Why those things fit Van Gogh so well is mostly attributable to the fact that his Mars in the ninth house is also the 10th lord. So it's also symbolizing king and father by its lordship. We find that Van Gogh also very accurately or clearly depicts the expected quality of being distanced from groups. And in fact, he had a strong religious inclination, but was kicked out of the priesthood for being too good, really, and had a very hard time forming a marriage. I would attribute that to the 12th lord joining the 2nd lord in the 10th house. 2nd house being family and groups, supportive groups. 12th lord being separation and loss, joining in the 10th house, which is a dissolving house. And in Van Gogh's case, this distance from groups really applied significantly to marriage and spouse. Why so much in his case? That's primarily attributed to the fact that his Mars in the ninth house is so close to Venus. His religious and philosophical tendencies are also quite discernible in this chart. First of all, from his Jupiter-Moon conjunction. And second of all, from the fact that his Mars in the ninth house is forming a Raja Yoga. So Jupiter-Moon is giving a lot of philosophy and religion on the mind. Jupiter being philosophy and religion, Moon being the mind. And Raja Yoga in the ninth house gives a lot of power or interest in philosophy and religion. One thing Van Gogh is also well known for is his own overall depression and mental instability. That's also very visible in the moon's proximity to Ketu and the 6th lord in the 6th house. Now, how about his incredible artistic talent? Well, it's first of all hinted at by Venus being Vargotama, exalted, in the 9th house as the 11th lord. Vargotama means it's in the same subdivision as the sign that it's in. So Venus is in Pisces, and it's also in the Pisces subdivision of Pisces, the Pisces Navamsha of Pisces. And Venus in Pisces is really great because it's exalted there. So it's an exalted Vargotama of Venus as the 11th lord, the house of art, in the 9th house, the house of prosperity. So that alone is a pretty significant indicator of a person that's really great with Venusian things like art. But it's not until you look at D9 that it pops out at you very strongly. This D9 or Navamsha has that very exalted Venus in the 3rd house, which is significant because 3rd house grants manual talent, which when it's granted through Venus will certainly be manual artistic talent. And that Venus is the 5th lord in his Navamsha, which is the lord of creativity and expression. And in that Navamsha, the 3rd lord sits in the 11th house, the house of artistic expression. So you don't have to explain everything about a person by one placement. The fact that he's an artist doesn't have terribly much at all to do with his Mars in his 9th house. That's what I'm trying to say there. Another person with Mars in the 9th is Deepak Chopra. Now, fatherless and lawless, those don't seem to fit him. But all of those seeds of interpretation that we have from Mars in the 9th house do in fact play out in his life in terms of how he treats authorities in science and medicine. Deepak Chopra defies the authorities, subverts them, appropriates their terminology and research, breaks their rules, and establishes his own versions of their stuff. Leaving the herd, in his case, is clearly represented in how the scientific and medical communities wind up not accepting him. How about his involvement and talent with psychology? That's seen very easily through his chart. First of all, his Mars in the 9th house is in Scorpio, which is the 8th sign. So it's naturally a psychological sign. And there in Scorpio, it's with Jupiter, who signifies learning, and Mercury, who signifies intellect, in the 9th house, which also has to do about education. So he has a lot of passion to learn about psychology. Also, his 8th lord, psychological lord, joins with Ketu, psychological planet, in his 10th house, the most prominent house in the house of career. And that house happens to be Sagittarius, which is well inclined for learning and study. And finally, the moon aspects his ascendant. The moon is the mind, and his ascendant is in Pisces, a very psychological sign. Deepak Chopra also has a proclivity and talent acting in a guru role. So that, and his tendency to also be philosophical and incorporate philosophical stuff into what he's doing, it's also easily seen by the fact that he has multiple Raj Yogas in his 9th house centered around that Mars. And so because those Raj Yogas are all centered around his Mars, he's actually quite maverick in his approach towards religion and philosophy. One more person to examine with Mars in the 9th house is Krishna himself. Mars in the 9th house is supposed to make you hate or love the king. In other words, you either get really into enforcing and establishing rules, or you really hate all the rules and break them all. Krishna is a really excellent example of that, because he's the one that establishes all the rules, but also he's the one that's beyond all the rules. Mars in the 9th house is also Atata, which means fatherless. Krishna is a very literal example of that. Because he's the personality of original consciousness. So therefore he's described as Sarvakarna Karanam, which means the ungenerated all generator. So he has no generator, no father. Also, his Leela actually unfolds of losing the father as well, because he's separated from his biological mother and father for 11 years, right after birth. Leaving the herd or being different from your group is also very interesting to consider in Krishna, because the Upanishads describe Krishna as Nityo Nityanam, Chaitanas Chaitananam. In each one of these groups, he stands out. He's the singular eternal among plural eternals. He's the singular sentience among plural sentiences. So he's a member of every group, of everything that exists. Yet no group that exists contains him. And he's different from everything that exists. So all of these seeds of Mars in the 9th house have sprouted indeed, in Krishna's case, but into such amazingly powerful fruits. Why is that? Well, that's discernible fairly easily by just looking at how dignified everything in this chart is. His Mars in the 9th house itself is exalted in Capricorn. His Saturn, Mercury, and Moon are also exalted. That's 4 exalted planets. The Moon, exalted conjoined to the nodes, also confers that exalted dignity onto the nodes. So now that's 6 exalted planets. And the remainder of the planets, they're either domicile like Jupiter in Pisces, or they're in their root sign like Venus in Libra, or the Sun in Leo, which is even slightly better than being domicile. So there's a fantastic chart here. So in this soil, all the seeds will grow to produce their most mega opulent fruits.
If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2.
To understand Mars in the 10th house, we'll first review what the 10th house symbolizes, and then what Mars symbolizes. And then we'll pretty easily be able to sort out what Mars symbolizes when it's in there in the 10th house. So this is what the 10th house is. It's the middle of the sky that's right above our heads. And that one fact alone tells us everything we need to know about what it symbolizes. It symbolizes the open sky, which means it symbolizes things that are extremely visible. So by visibility, I mean this is the house of the extroverse. That means this is the house of the public. This is the house of society. This is the house of the male side of the world, the extroversive, the visible, the dominant. Because it's all about that, it's also all about fame. How visible are you? So it has to do with your career, what you're famous for, and how much status, how much respect, how much fame do you have. Thus, it's also the house of influence, power, and authority. And the open sky is about the wind and the effect of the wind too. So the 10th house has to do with movement, travel, things being pushed, things being displaced and moved. And hence it's not a stabilizing house, it's an unstable house, a destabilizing house. Now let's do a quick review of what Mars signifies. Mars is a planet of masculinity. That's the root of everything that it symbolizes. Masculinity has to do with independence and inception. So first and foremost, Mars is the planet of individuality, independence, freedom. Therefore, it symbolizes self-reliance, which is what you need to have in order to be independent. And therefore, it symbolizes strength, which is what you need to have to be self-reliant. Under the umbrella of strength, Mars symbolizes all the things that make us strong or increase our strength. So muscle, exercise, but also things like tools, weapons, technologies, machines. Mars symbolizes conflict because it's about powerful people who are independent. So it's about power that's not really cooperating, so to speak. So it results in contests, competitions, strife, warfare. Masculinity is also inceptive, which means it gets things started. So Mars signifies initiative, getting stuff started, having ambition, having motivation. In other words, passion, that's another word for motivation, right? Lusts, hungers, everything that gets something started. And also the strength that's involved with getting things started, which is better known as bravery. Mars signifies courage, confidence. And because of that, it also signifies dominance and command. The ability to have confidence in making a decision and committing to something. Now we've reviewed what Mars symbolizes and what the 10th house symbolizes. We're ready to deal with the question of what does Mars symbolize when it's in the 10th house? It's very easy to figure that out now. That's why it's worth it to do the review first. Because all you have to do is really put these two symbolic trees side by side and look for where they vibe with each other. Look for where they resonate with each other. For example, the 10th house has to do with your amount of power, right? Your influence over the world. And Mars also has to do with the same thing. We call it command, dominance. So when Mars is in the 10th house, that's how they vibe together. You have a planet of command in a house of influence. You have a planet of dominance in a house of dominance. And so that synergy between Mars and the 10th house forms the seed of the most lucid and fluent way that we can interpret Mars in the 10th house. We'll expand that seed a little bit in a moment, but right now let's look for two more seeds. The 10th house has to do with movement, so getting things moving, and Mars has to do with initiative, getting things started. So there's a synergy here between the planet that gets things started with the house that likes things to be moving. So that would be the second seed that we would need to explore to understand Mars in the 10th house. And the third one comes from the fact that the 10th house is masculine. And Mars is masculine. This is probably the most important synergy between Mars in the 10th house. So let's take a look now at these three seeds and how we would expect them to grow into interpretations. But remember, the type of soil that you plant a seed in affects the way that seed grows to a very great extent. So what we'll talk about next is the way we expect the seed to grow. But then we'll look at some actual charts that have Mars in the 10th house and talk about how the soil affected the growth of the seeds of Mars in the 10th house. So first, let's deal with this seed of the planet of dominance in the house of dominance, the planet of command in the house of influence. So this seed should grow into something like, here's a very strong leader. And what do we mean by a strong leader? We mean a person who's pretty dominant, maybe disciplinary. And now the second seed, here's the planet of initiative, getting things started, in the house of movement, things moving around. So the planet that likes to initiate movement in the house that likes movement. What do we expect from this seed? We expect a person who's moving quickly. They're at the head of their pack. They're quick, they're surprising. They're also in the lead, so that means they're appealing, people follow them, and they stimulate others to action. And now the third and possibly most important seed, here's the planet of masculinity in a masculine house. So what do we expect from this seed? It should produce somebody that's masculine in a good way. So we can say heroic. Masculine in a good way means they have good masculine traits. So it's not so much like disciplining others and constantly extroverting their force. That's immature masculinity. A good masculinity means self-discipline, self-control, and therefore they tend to get people's respect. So that's how these three seeds should probably grow. These are the interpretations that you should probably make with Mars in the 10th house. Why did we bother saying should probably? Because we don't know where you planted these seeds and how you took care of them. In other words, we don't know what chart they're in and what else is affecting them. In order to really know how Mars in the 10th house should be interpreted in a chart, you have to know that whole chart. So let's just try to play with this a little bit to give you an idea of what it means to read a chart with Mars in the 10th house. Let's talk about some people that have Mars in the 10th house. We have Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the wartime president of the United States. Very self-disciplined and got respected for self-discipline, conquering his diseases, polio, and so forth, by his own strength of will and discipline. And look at this next batch of people. We have Jean-Claude Van Damme, famous martial artist in the entertainment industry. Then we have Muhammad Ali, a very famous fighter. And then we have LeBron James, a very famous athlete. You would expect this kind of person with a dominant great Mars, right? Because Mars has to do with contests, competition, fighting, strength, and so forth. Now look at these three women who have Mars in the 10th house: Angelina Jolie, Raquel Welch, and Mata Hari. Here's Angelina Jolie's chart. A very interesting thing is how her Mars in the 10th house is counterbalanced by a very juicy Venus. Why juicy Venus? Venus in Cancer, in the first house, right on the ascendant. So it's for a woman. She has enough female qualities from this Venus in Cancer. What makes it really interesting is how she also has a huge spike of male qualities coming from Mars in Aries in the 10th house. And the two of these sit good together. And it's not like she doesn't know how to operate like her biological gender. She does, as we can see from this Venus in Cancer in the ascendant. But we can see that she also is able to draw from the qualities of the opposite gender and become very brave and assertive, etc. Besides that, her Venus is her 11th lord, and it's right next to Saturn, her 8th lord, and 11 plus 8 always equals sexy, because 11 is pleasure and 8 is reproduction. And also besides that, her particular Mars in her 10th house is enjoying the best of circumstances. So not only is it in its own sign, but it's in 3 Raja yogas, combinations for great success. So not only is she sexy, but she's famous. Very similar person is Raquel Welch. Here's her chart. Look what she also has. Venus in Cancer. Interesting. And that Venus is the 11th Lord in the 8th house. So again, 11 plus 8 equals not 19. It equals sexy. And look at her Mars in the 10th house. It does look a lot like Angelina Jolie's 10th house. It's mixed up with a bunch of Raja Yoga. She has 2. Then we have Mata Hari. Here's her chart. It also has Venus in Cancer. And her Mars is also looking a lot like these other 2 women in the 10th house with 2 other planets. Here you can see it's in a really good sign for it. It's in Leo with the sun. Mars likes to be in fiery environments. So in Leo and with the sun is great for Mars. And it's also in a Raja Yoga. But her Mars is combust by the sun, which is not so hard for Mars. But it does show how she's not quite the same type of person as these other 2 ladies. When she's a spy and she's involved in espionage. Let's also take a look at these 2 classic Marsy men, Jean-Claude Van Damme and Muhammad Ali, the fighters. So Jean-Claude Van Damme's chart is really cool from an astrologer's perspective of how fun it is to read this chart. Because look at his Mars in his 10th house carefully. It's debilitated. That's not supposed to be a great thing. And also look at the sun in his 1st house. It's also debilitated. But that Saturn domicile in the 4th house is carrying this chart so strongly. Saturn to Mars making mutual aspect, causing Neech Bhang Raj Yoga by mutual aspect between the 5th and the 7th lords. Saturn Sun also forms a mutual aspect. Don't forget, every planet aspects the 4th house, though not to exactly 100%, but to a very strong aspect of 75%. So the Sun is aspecting Saturn quite squarely, and Saturn has a perfect aspect to its square. It's 270 degree square. So there's another mutual aspect in Saturn and the Sun causing another really good yoga. That yoga is a combination of 5 and 11 lords, which is great for entertainment. And the interesting thing about Van Damme that makes him different from Muhammad Ali is that he's not a fighter, he's a movie fighter. Also, he has really strong masculine houses. His 3rd and his 6th lord are the same planet as is the case for Libra, but that lord is domicile in the 3rd. So 3 and 6 strong is great for masculine things. And his moon's 3rd house is also really good. Muhammad Ali's chart is also pretty interesting. You see that his Mars in the 10th house is combined with Saturn, which makes it a combination between the 9th Lord Mars and the 7th Lord Saturn. So his Mars in the 10th house is there in a Raja Yoga. His Saturn and his Venus form a borderline mutual aspect and also do a fully formed house exchange. So they're very connected, Saturn and Venus, for Muhammad Ali. And guess what lords they are? 3 and 6, which are really important for manliness and the ability to fight. So you can see how important it is to take the seed interpretations and check the soil that they're growing in. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. to fluently and lucidly interpret Mars in the 11th house, make sure that, first of all, you're very clear about what Mars represents and what the 11th house represents. So let's start there real quick. This is the 11th house. Houses are areas of the sky. And as you can see, the 11th house is the part of the sky that's above our heads, but on the eastern segment. And that's important because that's the basis for everything that it symbolizes. Because it's up above us, it symbolizes the public world, society. And because it's to the east, it symbolizes society benefiting us. And that's what everything in the 11th house is all about, how we benefit from society. So you can divide it into two segments, social benefits and cultural benefits. Social benefits are things like friends. But these are not family friends. These are friends. These are social friends, social contacts, people that you meet at parties, people that you go to parties with, people that you invite to parties. Similarly, we can say it's the house of contacts, people who you know, who can help you get the stuff that you want. And another way that we socially benefit from society is that society is our market in which the merchant sells things. So you get income from the 11th house because you're getting from society. People are paying you. How do we benefit culturally from society? Well, society has a whole bunch of theaters, cinemas, concert halls, etc. And so the 11th house signifies arts, performance of arts, enjoyments of arts, entertainment, entertainers, and so forth. And because it symbolizes art and artists, it signifies talents, artistic talents. And not just in the performance, but also in the enjoyment of art. People tend to overlook that it also takes talent to enjoy art. So it's like refinement and talent is symbolized by the 11th house. And finally, what do we get basically from everything in the 11th house? Pleasure, enjoyment. Now let's talk about Mars. And what does Mars symbolize? Mars symbolizes masculinity. That's the basis of everything else that it symbolizes. Masculinity has two key facets to it. It's independent and it's inceptive. So Mars signifies individuality, independence, freedom. It's not cooperative. It signifies self-reliance, because self-reliance is what you need to have independence. It signifies strength, because strength is what you need to be self-reliant. It signifies all the things that make us strong and increase our strength. So not only muscles and exercise like that, but also weapons, tools, technologies, machines, and so forth. Finally, since it's individualistic and not cooperative, it signifies conflict. So this is why Mars indicates competition, contest, struggle, strife, war, violence, and anger. Now, on the side of inceptivity, initiative, ambition, go-get-emness, let's do thisness. That's why it signifies passion, because passion is what drives you to get off your ass and do something. It signifies bravery, which is the willingness to embrace the passion and take the initiative. And finally, it signifies command, because a person who has bravery has command. Because bravery gets rid of hesitation and allows us to make decisions. And making decisions is the key component of giving commands, being dominant. Now that we know what Mars signifies and what the 11th house signifies, we could be lucid and fluent in interpreting Mars in the 11th house. It's not that difficult. All we need to do is take the symbolisms of Mars and put them next to the symbolisms of the 11th house and see where they are on the same page or off the same page. For example, the 11th is the house of pleasure and Mars is the planet of passion. So these two obviously are on the same page. They synergize really well. The planet of passion in the house of pleasures. That's a seed of how we will interpret Mars in the 11th. It's just a seed for now. Let's just get our seeds straight. Another thing about Mars in the 11th is that the 11th is the house of talents and Mars is the planet of strengths. So talents are our strengths. So these two synergize well too, and this is another seed of how to interpret Mars in the 11th. And finally, the 11th symbolizes friendships, but Mars symbolizes individuality. So we might mistake this as being off the page with each other. We might mistake this as a clash. But remember the picture that I showed you of what the 11th house physically is.
It's on the eastern side of the overhead quadrant. So the 11th house is about friends, but not in terms of how we support our friends or we sacrifice for our friends. Quite the opposite. It's about how we benefit from our friends. So Mars being the planet of individuality and the 11th being the house of friendships actually works together. Now let's try to grow these seeds a little bit. The way that they grow is highly dependent upon the soil that they're in. So it's impossible to make a video about Mars in the 11th house and explain to you how to interpret it. But I can show you the seeds and the way that those seeds basically grow and alert you that you have to consider the soil around the seed. In other words, what else is in this house? What else is affecting Mars? And what else is in the chart? That will certainly have a huge effect. And we'll look at that as well in this video. But first, let's just flesh these seeds out a little bit more and grow them. So about this first seed, that the 11th is the house of pleasure and Mars is the planet of passion. That means that people with Mars in the 11th house are wealthy people. They have passion for pleasures. So they go after pleasures, they go after luxuries. They're ambitious people. They have strong motivations to acquire pleasures and wealth. They're luxurious people. They like luxury. They expect high-class things. And they tend to have high ambitions. Now, the 11th is the house of talents, and Mars is the planet of strengths. So people with Mars in the 11th house are powerful people. In other words, strength is their talent. So these are the people who are athletic, healthy, and they're able to be effectively dominant and assertive. Also, people with Mars in the 11th house tend to be talented people. It depends on the soil, how this particular seed will grow. Will it grow more towards strength or more towards talent? And now this final seed, the 11th is the house of friends, and Mars is the planet of individuality, but the 11th friends are friends that benefit the self. So people with Mars in the 11th house are well-behaved. Now, let me explain that. Their selfishness is effective, and so it doesn't cause too many problems. That's what it means when you have Mars in the 11th house. Your selfishness is not malfunctioning. Your selfishness is getting rewarded. Mars is selfishness. 11th house is reward. So you're able to interact with people and friends in a way that you always benefit from it, and they don't feel bad about it. Therefore, people with Mars in the 11th house have integrity, and they're kind of likable and respectable. Now let's start to talk about soil that these seeds grow in. So let's look at some well-known people who have Mars in the 11th house using a whole sign system and tropical signs. So basically, we're expecting to find people who are athletes, artists, or highly respected or admired. So for artists, there's a lot of artists with Mars in the 11th house. Mozart, Salvador Dali, Harrison Ford, Al Pacino, Orson Welles, Elvis Presley, Dolly Parton, Janis Joplin, Dave Grohl. You can see they're gritty also. They're gritty artists. Mozart may be a little bit out of our context to understand how kind of flamboyant or weird he was. But Mozart as well. They're all gritty, unusual, individualistic artists. And that's the nature of Mars. So, for example, Salvador Dali. Let's take a look at Salvador Dali's chart and just see what kind of soil is this chart providing to Mars in the 11th house that makes it grow not as an athlete but as an artist. Well, as you know, you really want to combine 3, 5, and 11 to get a fantastic artist. That's the artist yoga. Houses 3, 5, and 11. Look at Salvador Dali. The third lord is Mercury. It's with the fifth lord, Mars, in the 11th house. So fifth lord, Mars, in the 11th house, with the third lord in the 11th house, and the 11th lord, Venus. So, of course, this is just like an eye-opener. This is off the chart artistic context to Mars being in the 11th house. Besides artists, there's a few important athletes, Caitlyn Jenner and O.J. Simpson. Let's take a look at these two. Caitlyn Jenner not only is an athlete, but is a famous person for gender dysphoria or gender rights or whatever. So what is it about her that indicates that? So as you know, the gender neutral or bigendered planets are Mercury, Saturn, and Ketu. So let's look at Caitlin's chart. First lord, the house of the body, is Mars in the 11th house. And what sign is it? Virgo. It's Mercury sign. And what planet is it with? Saturn. So the first lord is in a bigendered sign, the sign owned by a bigendered planet with a bigendered planet, while the moon is in Saturn's sign. So the moon is also, the first lord is in a bigendered owner sign. The moon is also in a bigendered owner sign. And then Mercury, which is the bigendered planet, is with Ketu, which is the bigendered planet. So there's a lot of bigenderalness going on in this chart that is not coming from Mars in the 11th house. You don't have to interpret Mars in the 11th house to mean gender dysphoria just because Caitlyn Jenner has Mars in the 11th house. It's the fact that it's in Virgo as Mars, the masculine planet in Virgo, with Saturn, while the moon is in Saturn's sign, while Mercury is with Ketu. And now let's move on to O.J. Simpson, not just famous as an athlete, but famous as a violent criminal. What has he got? Look at his Mars in the 11th house. It's with Rahu. So it's not very stable, is it? It's kind of wild Mars in the 11th house. And then on top of that, his moon is by itself in the 8th house, and his Saturn is in Leo rising. Now, finally, let's look at some people that are well respected with Mars in the 11th house. Sister Emmanuelle, Marie Curie, and Lucky Luciano. So the first two, Sister Emmanuelle and Marie Curie, are respected for their positive contributions to society. Lucky Luciano is just respected as a mob boss, just respected out of fear. That kind of respect. Let's look at Lucky Luciano. Why is it? Do we expect Mars in the 11th house to produce gangsters? No, it has to have the context that leads towards crime and brutality. And then you can get an O.J. Simpson or a Lucky Luciano. So, for example, his Mars is combust, and it's conjoined Saturn, who is also combust, and who is the lord of the 12th house. And it's conjoined a new moon. This Mars is conjoined to the Sun, Saturn, and Moon, and Mercury. And the moon is blank. It's a new moon, and it's the 6th lord, and Mercury is the 8th lord. So his Mars in the 11th house is with the 3 deuce-ton lords. The 3 difficult houses, 12, 6, and 8, are all there with his Mars in the 11th house. Plus, on top of that, his basic chart structure is to only have 3 signs occupied, which inclines one towards fighting. Understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, and visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. The newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding. To understand Mars in the 12th house, let's begin by reviewing what the 12th house symbolizes. The 12th house is the part of the sky that's directly above the eastern horizon, and so everything that it symbolizes has to do with eroding the east. The east is where the sun rises, so it signifies things becoming visible, and it signifies the self. So the 12th house, therefore, signifies invisibility, things that are intangible, things that are abstract, things that don't have concrete form, spirit, ideas.
It signifies unknown things, things that are not available to your eyes, things that are too far away, alien things, foreign things, things from other countries. And it signifies the opposite of rising into being, but rather declining out of being, losing energy, spending your power, spending your money. Since it's the erosion of self, it's also the house that symbolizes humility, or the removal of the self from the spotlight. So it also signifies isolation. So it signifies enemies, critics, detractors. And thus the house signifies weakness, fatigue, and giving up. Now, to understand Mars in this house, we just need to compare these symbolisms with what Mars symbolizes. So what does Mars symbolize? Fundamentally, at the basis, Mars symbolizes masculinity, and masculinity has two key components to it. It is independent, and it is inceptive. So Mars signifies independence and individuality and freedom. The lack of need to be protected by a group. So Mars signifies self-reliance, and therefore Mars signifies strength. All the things that give us strength come under this umbrella. So Mars signifies muscles, Mars signifies weapons, Mars signifies tools, technologies, machines, and so on. Mars also signifies conflict, which is what happens when people are not in the same group. Masculinity is also inceptive, so Mars signifies inceptivity, which means initiative, ambition, drive, passion, lusts, hungers, driving forces. Mars signifies bravery, the capacity to pursue those forces. Bravery, courage, confidence. And when you have confidence and bravery, and then you're pursuing your desires, then you are in command. So Mars signifies command, dominance, direction giving. Now, to understand Mars in the 12th house, we just need to compare what Mars symbolizes with what the 12th house symbolizes. For example, there's something really important. The 12th house signifies weakness, but Mars signifies strength. So when you have the planet of strength in the house of weakness, what's going to happen? That's what you need to start envisioning and thinking about to be able to understand Mars in the 12th house. There's a lot of ramifications of this strength and weakness clash. Weakness also means humility. Strength also means dominance. Mars is dominant. So the strength-weakness clash is also a clash of dominance versus humility. Humility also means bowing and declining, whereas dominance also means rising and ascending. So Mars in the 12th house also has this facet to it of a clash between ascent and descent, rising and falling, getting stirred up and then getting cooled down. And on that note, rising also means arousal. Mars is about passion. And declining also means resting, fatigue. The 12th house is fatigue, but Mars is passion, energy. I'll spell this out a little bit more clearly for you, but let's identify two more abstract seeds of Mars in the 12th house. One thing is that the 12th house is the house of enemies. And Mars is a planet of conflict. So this is actually kind of nice. It goes well to have the planet of conflict in the house of enemies. And you can imagine that in your head to get an idea of what Mars in the 12th house is basically doing. Another thing is, the 12th is the house of the unknown. Far off places, places you haven't seen before. And Mars is a planet of freedom. It loves to roam. It loves to go wherever it wants into new territories. So let's stick these seeds in a pot and see what happens to them. Because of this clash between the planet of strength and the house of weakness, people with Mars in the 12th house, they're kind of unsteady. Sometimes they're up, sometimes they're down. They have a polarity to them, a bipolarity that is significant in their personality. So they won't have steadiness in their convictions and their ambitions. For example, sometimes they'll want something a lot, and then they'll forget that they even wanted it. sometimes they'll really be motivated to do something, and in other times they have no motivations. They also have unsteadiness in the dominant submissive dynamic. They're not a consistently dominant person, nor are they consistently a submissive person. They're a kind of unique mix of the two, and you never really know when they're going to adopt one side or the other. They also have an interesting polarity with visibility and invisibility. They come into view, they go out of view. While they're in view, they're not even really in view, in a sense. Now, that's kind of the challenge of Mars in the 12th house, but one of the nice things of Mars in the 12th house is it's kind of good to have the planet of conflict in a house of enemies, people you should conflict with. So people with Mars in the 12th house, they tend to fight pretty well. And this third thing about Mars in the 12th is that Mars loves the freedom to roam. It's very independent and it likes to be able to roam. And the 12th house has a lot of space to roam. It's all about foreign places. So people with Mars in the 12th house, they have one thing about them that's quite consistent is they get turned on by exploration. They like the chance to go somewhere new. They want to relocate often. They want to go somewhere new. They like other countries. They like to be able to just go wander somewhere. So I'll mention 5 people who are well known who have Mars in the 12th house, using my system, which is tropical zodiac signs and whole sign houses. Joe Biden, Pablo Picasso, Stephen King, Oprah Winfrey, and Bruce Lee. Now, obviously, all of these people have very powerful charts. And in the context of those very powerful charts, they have Mars in the 12th house. Not everybody has Mars in the 12th house in a very powerful chart. Joe Biden is a very good example of Mars in the 12th house, actually, because he's the president of the United States, which is a very powerful position, but he's a very wishy-washy kind of person. So it really illustrates that dichotomy of the planet of strength in the house of weakness, simultaneously in a strong position, but in a weak way. Pablo Picasso, what I want to point out about him is, here's a person who's famous from behind a brush. Stephen King also is very similar. He's famous from behind a typewriter. So here's an interesting thing of the planet of visibility in the house of invisibility. So even when he does become famous for something, it's not really him that you see. Oprah Winfrey too, she's extremely famous for what? For making other people famous. She's very famous for giving spotlights to other people. And then probably, to me at least, the most interesting of all of these people, Bruce Lee. Just so unsteady in how his rise to fame is so meteoric, so intensely quick, and then he died right away. Understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, and visit my website, vicdecara.com, and click readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.